The attic was exactly the kind of place no one goes looking until someone does. I was 8 years old when I found the file, my grandfather's file, the one that proved his own son, my father, had been quietly stealing his company out from under him for 6 years, one doctored signature at a time. That was the day I learned my father wasn't the man I thought he was. My grandfather built Hale Manufacturing from a garage in 1972 into a $40 million operation. He trusted his son, my father, to run it. For 6 years, my father smiled at family dinners while quietly draining the company into a shell account. The file held bank records, forged signatures, and a handwritten note. Phase 3, retirement plan. I was 8, and I understood exactly what that meant. My grandfather was supposed to lose everything. I had a choice: tell my grandfather and destroy his son, or keep silent and watch the theft continue. But what I didn't know yet was that my father wasn't alone. And the person he was working with was someone I should have seen coming. My grandfather, Henry Hale, started a machine parts factory in 1972 with nothing but a second-hand lathe and a handshake. By 1996, the year I was born, that factory had grown into Hale Manufacturing, a family-run company with 200 employees and a reputation for never missing a delivery. My grandfather was the kind of man who still walked the floor every morning, knew every worker's name, and kept the original lathe bolted to the lobby floor like a relic. He believed in legacy, in passing things down. So when my father, Michael Hale, came to him in 2004 and asked to take over day-to-day operations so Henry could enjoy retirement, my grandfather handed over the keys with tears in his eyes and not a single signature that required a second glance. That was the mistake. I didn't know it yet, but the file I found in the attic was 3 years old by the time I held it in my hands. My father was a careful man. That is not a compliment. He was careful the way a man is careful when he knows he is doing something that would destroy him if it ever came to light. He smiled easily at Sunday dinners. He brought my mother flowers every Friday. He coached my little league team and never raised his voice. And while he was doing all of that, while he was being the version of himself everyone believed in, he was also opening credit lines in the company's name, routing payments through a vendor account that existed only on paper, and slowly transferring ownership of key assets into a trust registered in the Cayman Islands. The file I found wasn't even the full plan. It was the backup copy, the one he thought no one would ever look for. What I held that afternoon in the attic was a manila folder, thick with paper that smelled like old dust and something sharper underneath, like toner and bad decisions. Inside were bank statements I didn't fully understand yet, deposit slips with my father's handwriting, and a flowchart that broke down what he called Phase 1, consolidation Phase 2, asset transfer Phase 3, retirement plan. Retirement plan was in quotation marks, which even at 8 years old I recognized as suspicious. Next to that was a list of names. My grandfather's name crossed out, my mother's name with a question mark, and a third name I didn't recognize, someone named Garrett. That name would matter later in a way I was not ready for. I sat on the attic floorboards and read everything I could, my chest getting tighter with every page. Here, what I understood. My father was stealing from his own father, not a little bit, not a few $1,000s he planned to pay back. He was systemically draining a company my grandfather had spent 30 years building, and the plan had phases. That meant it was still happening. The theft wasn't finished. And the note about Phase 3, retirement plan, meant he intended for my grandfather to be left with nothing by the time he was done. I closed the file and put it back where I found it, but I took one thing: a deposit slip dated March 11, 2007, with an account number I didn't recognize and my father's neat signature at the bottom. I folded it into the smallest square I could manage and tucked it inside the sole of my shoe. I didn't tell anyone that night. I ate dinner across the table from my father while he asked me about spelling tests, and I answered him like I still believed he was my dad. I did that for 3 weeks. But here's the thing about an 8-year-old carrying a secret that big: it doesn't stay hidden. It leaks out in silence, in lost appetite, in staring at your grandfather a moment too long when he's showing you how to plant tomatoes in the backyard. My grandfather noticed. Henry Hale noticed everything. That was how he built a company. He paid attention to details that other people ignored. One afternoon, he found me sitting on the back steps, and he sat down next to me, slow, The way men with bad knees sit down. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he asked me if I wanted to see the old lathe at the factory. I said yes, because I didn't know how to say what I actually needed to say. That visit changed everything. I saw the workers. I saw the machines. I saw the way my grandfather placed his hand on the lobby lathe, almost reverent, and said, "This is yours someday. Your father's running it now, but it's yours. Remember that." I pulled the deposit slip out of my shoe that night and put it on his kitchen table. He looked at it for a long time. Then he asked me to tell him exactly where I found it. I did. And for the first time in my life, I watched my grandfather cry. What I didn't know was that my father had an accomplice inside the company, someone who had access to the accounting software, who could approve invoices without raising red flags, who understood exactly how to make money disappear into a shell corporation without triggering a single audit alert. That person was the name on the flowchart, Garrett. And Garrett was my mother's brother, my uncle. My father wasn't just stealing from his own father. He was doing it with the help of my mother's family. That night, my grandfather didn't sleep. Neither did I. I lay in my bed and listened to his footsteps moving through the house, slow, deliberate, packing the same hallway over and over like a man trying to walk his way through a math problem that wouldn't solve. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, I heard him pick up the phone in his study. He spoke quietly for maybe 30 minutes. The next morning, he sat me down at the kitchen table and told me something I never forgot. "What you found in the attic," he said, "is not the only copy." He had suspected something was wrong for almost a year, not with my father specifically, but with the books. Revenue was climbing, orders were up, but cash reserves were thinning in ways that didn't make sense. He'd already hired a forensic accountant. I didn't know what forensic meant at the time, but I understood what my grandfather told me next. The accountant, a woman named Ellen, had been tracing irregularities for weeks. She had found small things, duplicate vendor payments, invoices routed through a shell company, a pattern that suggested someone inside the company was moving money in increments small enough to look like rounding errors. She hadn't been able to tie it to a person yet, but the deposit slip I gave my grandfather was the missing piece. It connected the shell account directly to my father's signature, and when they pulled the records on that account, they found something else. The account wasn't in my father's name. It was registered to a company called Garrett Holdings, incorporated 6 years earlier, right around the time my father started handling day-to-day operations. My grandfather didn't have a son named Garrett, but his daughter-in-law did. Garrett Cole was my mother's older brother, a man I'd met maybe 4 times in my life, always at family gatherings where he stood a little too far from the center, smiling with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. My grandfather had never liked him. He called him that slick man with the handshake that lasts a beat too long. Now he had a name on a shell account and a brother-in-law who was apparently the co-author of a plan to drain a $40 million company into oblivion. But there was a second account, one even deeper, one Ellen uncovered while tracing where the money went after Garrett Holdings. A trust in the Cayman Islands, established jointly by Michael Hale and Garrett Cole, with a single beneficiary listed on the distribution schedule: me. I can't explain what it felt like to see my own name printed on stolen documents under the heading Successor Trustee. I was 8. I didn't know what Successor Trustee meant precisely, but I knew it meant I was part of the lie, whether I wanted to be or not. My grandfather didn't call the police right away, not because he was protecting my father. He was protecting me and maybe my mother if she was innocent, and he didn't know yet if she was innocent. He decided to confront Garrett first, quietly off the record, to find out how far the conspiracy went and whether my father was the mastermind or just a participant. Ellen kept digging. I stayed out of school for a week, pretending to have a stomach bug. I ate toast and sat in the study while my grandfather made calls and stared at spreadsheets, and I learned more about money laundering in 5 days than most adults learn in a lifetime. The first major turning point came on a Thursday. Ellen called with news. She had found the master spreadsheet, not the one in the attic that was an early draft. The real one, the live document, was on a shared drive inside the company's own server. Michael and Garrett had been updating it weekly, tracking every diverted payment, every falsified invoice, every asset transferred to the Cayman Trust. The total at that point, just under $12 million. $12 million siphoned over 6 years, from a company that employed 200 families in a small Ohio town. And according to the timeline on the sheet, Phase 3 was scheduled to execute in 3 weeks. Phase 3 wasn't just a retirement plan, it was a full liquidation. They were going to sell the factory's equipment, close the doors, and pocket the remaining value as a final payout before disappearing. The Cayman Trust was the escape route. My grandfather sat down heavily in his chair when he heard that. His face did something I'd never seen. It closed, like a door shutting from the inside. He was a man who had built his life on the belief that hard work and loyalty were enough. Now his son had turned his life's work into a spreadsheet with exit dates. I asked him what we were going to do. He looked at me, and I saw something flicker behind the grief. It was the same look he got when he talked about the old days, when a competitor tried to undercut him and he ended up buying their factory instead. "We're going to move faster than they are," he said, "and we're going to make them think they're still ahead." That was the pivot. I didn't understand this at the time, but my grandfather had decided not to prevent the theft. He was going to let it continue under his watch and catch them in the act with enough evidence to guarantee a conviction and full clawback of every dollar. But to do that, we needed someone inside their operation, someone who could feed us the meeting dates, the transfer schedules, the next moves. And that person, impossibly, turned out to be my mother. My mother, Sarah, had been married to my father for 12 years, and I genuinely believe she loved him in the way that makes you blind to certain truths. But she was not a fool. Ellen had found something else on the shared drive, a series of emails between my father and Garrett discussing how much to tell Sarah if she ever started asking questions. They had a plan for that too. A document titled S Scenario, which suggested feeding her partial information about a legal tax restructuring and getting her to sign papers to move some personal assets into the trust. They were going to use her signature to shield the fraud by making her an unwitting co-conspirator. My grandfather read that email thread and nearly broke the desk with his fist. Then he called my mother, asked her to come over after I was in bed, and told her everything. I wasn't supposed to hear that conversation, but I was lying at the top of the stairs, breathing into the carpet. I heard my mother say, "No, no, this isn't possible." Then silence, then the sound of papers being passed across the table, then my mother crying in a way I'd never heard an adult cry before, like something had cracked and wasn't going to heal. After a long while, she said, "What do you need me to do?" From that point, we had a source. My mother became our eyes inside. She attended the planning conversations, nodded at the right moments, signed nothing that wasn't reviewed by Ellen first. She kept her face steady during family dinners while I sat across from my father and tried to remember that I was supposed to be a normal 8-year-old who didn't know the man buttering his bread was planning to sell his own father into financial ruin. And the whole time, my grandfather was building a parallel case. Every new transfer was mirrored, every fraudulent invoice catalogued, every Cayman deposit mapped to a corresponding US account that the IRS would eventually want to meet. But the strain was enormous. My father was getting anxious. The liquidation date was approaching, and he needed certain signatures from my grandfather to release equipment titles and real estate deeds, paperwork that had to appear voluntary to avoid red flags. He couldn't forge those. He needed my grandfather to sign, so he began applying pressure, not directly. He was too careful for that. Instead, he started planting doubts with the board members, suggesting that my grandfather's mental decline was accelerating, that maybe it was time for a formal transition of ownership. He fabricated medical concerns. He hired a lawyer who specialized in elder transitions, and then he scheduled a meeting, a surprise board meeting in 6 days, where he planned to present a motion to remove Henry Hale as chairman based on supposed incapacity. He intended to seize control just long enough to run the liquidation, then vanish with the proceeds. At this point, I need to pause and tell you something about my grandfather. Henry Hale was 71 years old and had survived a heart attack 2 years prior. He was not in decline, but my father knew the board would believe the medical reports if they were presented with enough paperwork. The move was cruel, calculated, and entirely consistent with a man who had been lying to everyone he loved for 6 years. But it also created a time pressure we hadn't anticipated. 6 days until the board meeting and 3 weeks until the liquidation. If my father won that vote, he could sign the documents himself and make the transfers irreversible. I remember sitting on the back steps again with my grandfather, the same spot where he'd shown me the deposit slip just weeks before. He was quiet, staring at the garden, Then he said something that I think about almost every day now. Sometimes the person you raised becomes a stranger in the same house. The final escalation came the next evening. My mother called while we were eating dinner. She was locked in the bathroom at their house, speaking so quietly we could barely hear her. She had overheard a phone call between my father and Garrett. They had found out about Ellen. They knew someone was investigating. They didn't know who had tipped us off, but they were accelerating the timeline. The equipment transfer was now happening in 48 hours, not 3 weeks. They planned to move the machinery to a new shell company in Indiana over the weekend, sell it immediately to an overseas buyer, and wire the funds offshore before anyone could file an injunction. My mother whispered, "Henry, they're going to take it all this weekend. There's no time." Then the bathroom door opened and she hung up. My grandfather set down his fork. For a long moment he didn't move. Then he turned to me and said, "Go pack a bag, you're staying with your aunt tonight." He stood, walked to the phone, and called a man I'd never heard him mention before, someone named Lou, who was apparently a former US attorney. "We're moving tonight," my grandfather said. They just pushed the button. He hung up and looked at me. "One chance," he said. "We have one chance to stop them before the whole thing evaporates." I didn't go to my aunt's house that night. I asked to stay. He let me. And what happened over the next 24 hours is something I still dream about in colors that don't exist outside of memory. Lou arrived at the house 40 minutes later with a leather satchel and 2 men I'd never seen before. One was a retired FBI forensic accountant. The other was a private investigator who specialized in corporate fraud. They set up in my grandfather's dining room like it was a war room, spreading documents across the table, and that's when I understood something my grandfather had kept from everyone, including me. He had been preparing for this night for 2 months. The moment Ellen found the first irregularity, he started building a response team, not to protect the company, to end this, completely and permanently, with every legal tool available, timed to a single moment when the evidence would be irrefutable and the perpetrators caught in motion. He just didn't know that moment would be tonight. Here's what they had: Ellen's full forensic report, 47 pages of transactions linking the shell accounts directly to my father and Garrett. They had correspondence intercepts, timestamps from the shared drive, and surveillance footage from the factory floor showing Garrett accessing accounting terminals after hours. But they were missing one thing: the Cayman Trust documents. Without those, the overseas funds could be frozen, but not recovered. And my father kept the trust originals in a safety deposit box only he could access. My mother had been trying to locate the key for weeks, but my father was paranoid. He carried it on a chain around his neck, even in the shower. So the first problem was physical. They had to separate my father from that key long enough to copy the documents, and they had less than 48 hours before the equipment transfer began. That's when my mother did something I still consider the bravest act I've ever witnessed. She volunteered to create a diversion by telling my father she wanted a divorce. Not in anger, not as a threat. Calmly, over dinner at a restaurant she knew he felt comfortable in, the kind of place where he'd be too embarrassed to make a scene. While he processed that, while he was off balance and the chain was off his mind, Lou's investigator would lift a clean impression of the key during the confusion of the evening. A quick press into soft wax, 30 seconds at most, and my father would never notice. The duplicate would be cut the next morning, and we'd have exactly one afternoon to access the box, photograph every page, and return it before anyone knew it was gone. I listened to them plan this from a chair in the corner of the dining room, my 8-year-old brain trying to hold on to details that felt like they belonged in a movie, not in my actual life. My grandfather noticed me sitting there around midnight and came over. He crouched down. "You don't have to be here for this part," he said. I asked him if my father was going to go to jail. He didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "Your father chose this, not you, never you, remember that." I nodded. I didn't believe him yet, but I wanted to. The dinner happened the next night. My mother, whom I had always thought of as quiet and gentle, walked into that restaurant in a blue dress and told a man who had been lying to everyone for 6 years that she couldn't stay married to someone she didn't recognize. She didn't mention the fraud. She talked about distance, about feeling like a stranger in her own house, about needing space to figure out who she was. All of it true, none of it revealing. My father, according to the report Lou received later, was completely unmoored. He didn't see her leaving as a consequence of his own actions. He saw it as another problem to manage, another variable in a plan that was starting to fray. And while he was trying to manage, the investigator pressed the key into wax during a handshake that lasted exactly 3 seconds too long. My father never felt a thing. The duplicate was ready by 7 the next morning. My mother, who legally still had access to the joint safety deposit box, entered the bank at 9:15, removed the trust documents, and met Ellen at a copy shop 2 blocks away. They photographed every page, every signature, every distribution schedule that listed me as successor trustee. That's when they found it. The thing that made everything worse. The thing that changed a fraud case into something far more sinister. The trust wasn't just a vehicle for offshore money. It was structured to survive my father's death. The succession clause named Garrett Cole as the trustee in the event my father died or became incapacitated. And attached to that clause was a separate insurance document, a life insurance policy on my grandfather, taken out 3 years earlier without his knowledge, with a death benefit of $5 million, payable to the Cayman Trust, with Michael Hale as the primary administrator. They weren't just stealing the company. They were waiting for my grandfather to die, and if the heart attack 2 years prior had gone differently, they would have collected. Worse, the policy had an acceleration clause for terminal illness. They had already inquired, through a third-party medical review service, about the qualifying conditions. They were monitoring his health. My grandfather wasn't just a victim of financial theft. He was an asset being tracked for liquidation in every sense of the word. Ellen called from the copy shop, her voice shaking. She'd been a forensic accountant for 22 years. She'd seen embezzlement, money laundering, even arson for insurance. She said she had never seen a son take out a policy on a living father while simultaneously draining his company. "Henry," she said, "this is beyond fraud. This is premeditated financial homicide." My grandfather didn't speak for a full minute. Then he said, "Photograph it all, triple backups. And Ellen, send the policy to Lou, right now." This is the moment where most stories about family betrayal turn to revenge, but my grandfather was not interested in revenge. He told me this later, and I've never forgotten it. "Revenge is a feeling," he said. "Justice is a structure. You can't build anything lasting on a feeling." What he wanted was not to destroy his son. What he wanted was to make it impossible for his son to destroy anyone else ever again. And to do that, he needed the policy, the trust documents, the 47-page forensic report, and one more thing he didn't have yet. A confession, verbal or written, that would tie Michael directly to the plan and remove any defense of ignorance or coercion. He needed my father to admit what he had done, on the record, with witnesses. The window for that confession was vanishingly small. The equipment transfer was starting in 36 hours. Trucks had already been contracted. The buyer in Indiana was waiting. My father and Garrett were moving faster now, spooked by Ellen's investigation, uncertain of how much we knew. My mother was still in the house, playing the role of the distressed wife considering divorce, and that gave us one last entry point. She would tell my father she wanted to understand the family finances before she signed anything, and she would ask him to explain directly how the company restructuring worked. If he trusted her enough, and he still did, because she was the mother of his child, and he still believed she was on his side, he might walk her through the plan out loud, in enough detail to hang himself. That conversation was scheduled for Saturday morning, the day before the transfer, but on Friday night, everything accelerated again. Garrett showed up at the factory at 9 p.m. with 2 moving trucks and a crew of 6 men. They weren't waiting for the weekend. They were moving the equipment now, under cover of darkness, before anyone could file an injunction or freeze the accounts. The night security guard called my grandfather, confused, asking why there was a midnight inventory relocation on the schedule. There was no schedule. Garrett had forged a work order. My grandfather called Lou. Lou called the local prosecutor, who happened to be awake and owed Lou a favor from a decade-old case. 45 minutes later, 3 sheriff's deputies pulled into the factory parking lot with lights off, blocking the loading dock. Garrett was standing on the dock with a clipboard, watching the first lathe get winched onto a flatbed. The deputies didn't arrest him, not yet. They told him there was a noise complaint from a neighboring property, asked to see his permits, and stalled him for 2 hours while Lou prepared the emergency injunction paperwork. By midnight, the equipment was unloaded and the trucks were gone, and Garrett was on the phone with my father in a panic. Here's what my father should have done. He should have run. The Cayman Trust had enough money to disappear. He could have been on a plane by morning, but he didn't run because he still believed he could talk his way out. That was the fundamental flaw in Michael Hale, the thing my grandfather understood and exploited. He believed he was the smartest person in every room, and smartest people don't run. They pivot, they adapt, they find a new angle. So instead of fleeing, my father called an emergency board meeting for Sunday afternoon, advancing his incapacity motion by 4 days. If he couldn't liquidate the equipment in secret, he'd seize control publicly and do it with board approval. He spent all of Saturday preparing his case, medical affidavits, performance reviews that criticized my grandfather's disengagement, a transition plan that looked professional and reasonable on its face. But there's a problem with building a case against a man you've already taken a life insurance policy out on. When that policy becomes evidence in a criminal investigation, every document you submit to prove incapacity becomes another piece of the conspiracy. My father didn't know we had the policy. He didn't know we had the trust. He didn't know his wife had photocopied his safety deposit box. He walked into Sunday's board meeting believing he was about to win. And my grandfather let him. The boardroom was on the 3rd floor of Hale Manufacturing, a long walnut table surrounded by 12 chairs that had held the same board members for years, people who had known my father since he was a teenager, who had watched him grow up inside the company. My mother attended as a shareholder, seated quietly near the window. I was not there. I was at my aunt's house, finally, waiting beside a phone that didn't ring for hours. My grandfather began the meeting by letting my father present his case. For 40 minutes, Michael laid out a methodical argument for transition. He had charts. He had medical opinions. He had testimonials from 2 employees who had been pressured into providing statements. He was convincing, measured, the version of himself everyone wanted to believe. When he finished, the room was quiet in the way rooms get when no one wants to be the first to speak. Then my grandfather stood. He thanked his son for the presentation. He said it was thorough, well-researched, and completely incorrect. He placed a folder on the table. Inside were the forensic report, the trust documents, the life insurance policy, and a transcript of the conversation my mother had recorded that Saturday morning, the one where my father, believing he was explaining a tax restructuring to his soon-to-be ex-wife, had walked her through the entire scheme, the shell accounts, the Cayman transfers, the liquidation timeline, and his plan to retire Henry permanently from any influence. That phrase, retire permanently, combined with the life insurance policy, was legally devastating. The board members opened the folders. I'm told the silence that followed lasted nearly 3 minutes. One board member, a woman named Patricia who had worked with my grandfather since the 80s, put her hand over her mouth and didn't remove it. Another stood up and walked to the window and just stood there, back to the room, shoulders moving. My father's face, according to my mother, went through a series of expressions she couldn't categorize. Confusion first, then recognition, then something she described as watching a building realize it's been demolished from the basement up. He asked for a recess, denied. He asked to speak to his father privately, denied. He asked if the police were outside. My grandfather said, not yet, that depends on the next 5 minutes. He offered my father a single option, resign all positions immediately, cooperate fully with the asset recovery, and sign a confession in exchange for a lighter referral to the prosecutor's office. No running, no spin. No deal beyond a narrow window of cooperation that would affect sentencing, not charges. My father looked at my mother. She didn't look away, but she didn't rescue him either. He looked at the board members who had mentored him, promoted him, believed in him. None of them met his eyes. Then he signed. Not because he was sorry, though that would come later maybe, in ways I'll never fully know. He signed because he had finally run out of angles. But this is where the story should end, and it doesn't, because Garrett Cole was not in that boardroom. Garrett was 2 miles away at the company's secondary warehouse, and he had just received a phone call from someone inside the building warning him that the whole thing had collapsed. Garrett didn't sign anything. He didn't wait for police. He drove straight to our house, the house where I was supposed to be staying with my aunt, the house where I actually was at that exact moment because my aunt had gone to the grocery store and left me alone with the back door unlocked. I didn't know Garrett was coming. I was sitting on the living room floor, watching a cartoon with the volume low, the phone on the table beside me. My aunt had said she'd be back in 20 minutes. She'd been gone for 10. I heard a truck pull into the driveway too fast, gravel spraying against the undercarriage. I looked out the window and saw a man I recognized from family gatherings, a man whose eyes had never met mine directly, walking toward the back door like he already knew it was open. I had about 5 seconds. I grabbed the phone and I ran. Not outside, the truck was blocking the driveway, but up. Up the stairs, into the attic, to the same spot where I'd found the file weeks before, the one place in the house I knew had a latch on the inside. I pulled the attic door shut behind me, slid the bolt, and sat in the dark with the phone pressed against my chest. Garrett came through the house calling my name. Not angrily, calmly, that was worse. He said he just wanted to talk. He said my grandfather had made a mistake and we needed to clear things up before someone got hurt. I didn't answer. I was 8 years old, barefoot, sitting on the same floorboards where this whole thing started, and I understood perfectly that if I made a sound, I would not be safe. I dialed my grandfather. He answered on the first ring. I whispered 2 words, "Garrett's here." He told me to stay quiet, stay locked in, and not come out for anyone except him. Then he hung up and called the sheriff. What happened next, I pieced together later from police reports and my grandfather's testimony. Garrett searched the house for maybe 8 minutes. He went through every room on the ground floor, then climbed the stairs. I heard his footsteps stop outside the attic door. The handle turned once, then again harder. He pushed. The latch held, an old iron slide bolt my grandfather had installed years ago to keep raccoons out, never imagining it would one day keep a predator out instead. Garrett said my name through the door, and his voice had changed. The calm was gone. There was something frayed underneath it now, something that knew time was running out. He said if I didn't come out, he'd have to find another way to make my grandfather listen. I said nothing. I held the phone and breathed into my knees. The sheriff's deputies arrived 6 minutes later. Garrett heard the sirens and ran. He made it to his truck, but the driveway was blocked by the patrol car, and he was arrested in the front yard with a backpack containing $30,000 in cash, 2 passports, one in his name, one in a name I didn't recognize, and a printed email from my father sent that morning that read, "If it falls apart, we need leverage. Henry cares more about the boy than the company. Remember that. Leverage." That word, they had discussed using me as a bargaining chip if the boardroom plan failed. My grandfather read that email in the police station parking lot and didn't speak for half an hour. Then he came home, climbed the attic stairs, unbolted the door, and sat down beside me on the floor. Neither of us said a word. He just put his arm around my shoulders and we stayed there, in the dark, until I stopped shaking. The legal aftermath took 2 years. Michael Hale pleaded guilty to conspiracy, fraud, and elder financial exploitation. Under the agreement my grandfather had offered in the boardroom, he received 10 years, reduced from a possible 25, in exchange for full cooperation with the asset recovery. He testified against Garrett in detail, walking prosecutors through every transfer, every forged document, every conversation about the insurance policy. Garrett Cole was convicted on 12 counts, including attempted kidnapping of a minor, which added 15 years to his sentence. He will not be eligible for parole until 2041. The Cayman Trust was seized and repatriated. Of the $12 million stolen, 11.4 was recovered. The rest had been spent on legal fees and a condo in Miami that the government auctioned to partial recovery. Hale Manufacturing did not close. It did not liquidate. The board voted unanimously to retain my grandfather as chairman, and he stayed in that role for 4 more years before retiring on his own terms, not anyone else's. My mother filed for divorce the Monday after the board meeting. It was finalized in 5 months, uncontested, because my father had no leverage left. She moved into a small house 2 miles from my grandfather's, went back to school, and became a licensed social worker specializing in elder abuse prevention. She has testified before state legislatures on financial exploitation laws. She turned what happened to us into a career of protecting other families from the same thing. I don't know if that's redemption exactly, but it's something close, something earned. My father wrote me letters from prison. I didn't read them for years. When I finally did, at 17, they contained what you'd expect: apologies, explanations, attempts to reframe the story so he wasn't quite the villain. Some of it might even have been sincere. I've learned that sincerity and manipulation can coexist in the same sentence, and that the people who hurt you most are often the ones who genuinely believe they had a reason. I wrote back once, a single page. I told him I forgave him, not because he deserved it, but because I didn't want to carry his choices around like a weight he had strapped to me without my consent. I never sent a second letter. I haven't seen him since I was 8. The lathe is still in the lobby, the original one bolted to the floor. My grandfather passed away 6 years ago, at 83, in his own bed, in a house that still had the mortgage paid off by a company that still bore his name. At his funeral, 200 people showed up, many of them former employees who told stories. I'd never heard about a man who remembered their kids' names and never missed a shipment. No one mentioned my father. It was as if that chapter had been written in ink that faded on contact with air. I spoke at the service. I told them about the tomatoes, about the back steps, about a man who taught me that justice is a structure and revenge is just a feeling. I didn't tell them about the attic. That part was ours. But here's what I haven't told you yet. The final thing I found in that file, the thing I didn't give my grandfather because I didn't understand it until years later. Behind the bank statements and the deposit slips, stapled to the back of the folder, was a photograph. Black and white, creased, clearly old. It showed 2 men in front of a small machine shop, younger than I ever knew them, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning. One was my grandfather. The other was my father, maybe 19 years old, wearing the same smile he'd worn at every Sunday dinner for the next 2 decades. On the back, in my father's handwriting, it said, "Dad and me, first day. He says it's all going to be ours someday." I found that photograph 3 weeks after my grandfather's funeral, going through the attic one last time before we sold the house. I sat on those floorboards, now 24 years old, and I looked at the 2 faces in that picture, and I thought about how a promise can become a prison when the person making it doesn't know who's listening. My father heard, "It will be yours," and decided he couldn't wait. My grandfather meant it as a legacy and received a theft. The same words, 2 different meanings, and a family broken in the space between them. Still have the photograph. I keep it in a drawer in my desk, not framed, not displayed, but not thrown away either, because it reminds me that every person in this story was human, even the ones who did unforgivable things. My father wasn't born a thief. He became one, choice by choice, rationalization by rationalization, until the man in that photograph, the 19-year-old with his arm around his dad, was unrecognizable to everyone, including himself. That doesn't excuse anything. It doesn't undo anything, but it complicates the narrative in a way that feels true, and truth is all I have left to offer. The company is still running. I sit on the board now, not as CEO, I hired someone better than me for that, but as the representative of a family that almost destroyed itself and didn't. Every quarter, I walk through the factory floor, past the old lathe bolted to the lobby, and I think about the boy in the attic holding a file he was never supposed to find. He saved a company. He saved his grandfather. He didn't plan to do either. He just found something that looked wrong and chose not to look away. That's the whole lesson, I think, not the revenge, not the justice, the looking, the refusing to pretend you didn't see what you saw, even when what you saw would break your family apart, because the breaking was already happening. The file just gave us a chance to decide which pieces were worth saving. I learned much later that what happened in my family is not rare. 90% of elder financial exploitation is committed by someone the victim knows and trusts, usually a family member, often an adult child who has, somewhere along the way, stopped seeing a parent and started seeing a payout. The Federal Trade Commission estimates that older Americans lose nearly $36 billion a year to financial abuse, and that number keeps climbing as the generation caring for aging parents and their own children finds itself squeezed into a pressure point where entitlement can start to feel like survival. I was 8 when I found a file in an attic that proved my father was not an anomaly. He was an example of something quiet and pervasive that nobody wants to talk about at dinner tables. But we should, because silence is the accomplice that never gets charged. The question people ask me most is whether I think my father was always capable of what he did. I don't have a clean answer. The photograph I found, the one of him at 19, grinning beside his dad on the first day at the shop, suggests a different person. I remember him coaching my little league team and showing me how to tie a double knot that wouldn't slip. Those memories are real. they just aren't the whole truth. And that's the uncomfortable reality about the people we love. They can contain versions of themselves that don't all belong to the same moral universe. My father loved me, and he planned to use me as a bargaining chip if his scheme collapsed. Both things are true. Holding them at once is not easy, but it's honest, and I'd rather carry an honest weight than a tidy lie. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, a strange bank statement, a missing deed, a relative who's suddenly too involved in an older family member's finances, pay attention. You don't need to be a forensic accountant. You just need to refuse to ignore what you've already noticed. The boy in the attic wasn't brave. He was just curious and stubborn and loved his grandfather more than he feared what the truth might cost. That's available to anyone. It doesn't require a file in a dusty attic, just the decision not to look away when the numbers don't add up or the explanations come a little too smooth. This channel exists to tell stories like this one, not because they're easy, but because the families who survive them sometimes need a testimony to point to that says, "We lived through that too." If this story meant something to you, hit the like button so more people can find it. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next one drops. We read every comment, and a lot of them have made me cry in ways I wasn't expecting. Thank you for being here. Sometimes the most important thing in the world is a person, of any age, who decides to point at the numbers and ask the simple question, does this make sense? That question saved my grandfather's life. It might save someone else's too.